Hello everybody, this is Sam Twiselton lying on my bed bizarrely, looking at a screen with Matt Hood on it. I'm looking forward to grilling him, and I hope you're going to help me with that. So Matt and I first did this session back at researchEDHome, I think it was just last month, wasn't it? My God, it feels like a lifetime ago. Matt, I actually remember us having a conversation about this annoying virus thing that we both agreed was just like another form of flu, and why was everybody making such a fuss? So it just goes to show what we know.
Not very much, yeah.
Luckily, we're not here to talk about that today. We are here to talk about educator expertise, a subject which is close to both Matt and my hearts, and Matt has got an awful lot to say about that. But I think before we just get into that, Matt, you have been a bit busy recently, and that annoying virusy thing is part of why you've been so busy. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that before we then get on with the main point of why we're here?
Yeah, sure. Great to be on this today, and hello to everybody who's joined in. I think we've got about 150 people, which is not bad for me and you, Sam, let alone me and you. 150, I'm pretty pleased with that. I've ended up with this slightly strange sort of COVID job portfolio, part of which has been helping to set up these researchEDHome conversations every day, which is fantastic, and I'm going to keep that going for the term, so do keep logging in at 11 o'clock. The second is working with a group of volunteers, in the main, teachers, about 60 or so of them now, who have created an online classroom and an online school to share their curriculum resources with their colleagues. Oak National Academy opened a week ago on Monday, so we're on day 8. We've smashed 3 million lessons now, from just over 1.2, I think, million children, which is just incredible. I think as we speak, the Secretary of State's getting grilled about us by the Select Committee, which is a little unfair on him. I think he just said he thought it was a good idea. Those resources are available for all teachers anywhere. So if you are a teacher and you are keeping on top of the amount of resource creation, transferring those resources online and getting them out to your pupils, the resources that these other teachers have created can be of any assistance to you at all. They're available at the national.academy, and you should use them as you wish, and you should give us feedback on how we can make them better. Big exciting thing for us next week is increasing the amount of specialist resources that we have available, so making the content that is on there more inclusive. We're looking at things like signing and subtitling of some of the lessons, making them better for kids with visual impairments, and including some resources for pupils who go to specialist settings, so special schools, alternative provision, pupil referral units. So that's coming next week. And tomorrow at 10 o'clock is assembly, which I recorded in my living room, and the Archbishop of Canterbury also recorded in his living room, which is totally bizarre and incredibly good fun. And so I'd really encourage you to tune into that. It's 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Share that with your pupils. It's a message from the Archbishop about hope, and it's lovely, and you will all enjoy it a lot.
I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. I know it's not what we're here to talk about, but I just thought we couldn't sort of miss the opportunity to hear a bit about that. Personally, I found it very useful to direct trainees who are kind of really stressed at the moment about the fact that they're not in school, finishing their placements, finishing their teacher training, and the fact that they can use it actually as a resource of sort of analysing practice, analysing explanations, etc., thinking about it in relation to how they prepare themselves for September. So yeah, multiple uses, really, really great thing. So anyway, what we're really here to talk about, though, is educator expertise. As I said, something that's close to both of our hearts, and something I know you talk about incessantly. And I've got some questions about that, and I've actually already been sent one from somebody as well. But before we get into the sort of detail, I just want to hear a bit from you, Matt, about why it matters to you so much, why this is something that kind of energises you and makes you bang on about it incessantly. Why is it that Matt Hood, you know, a guy from Morecambe, thinks this is a subject that matters so much?
So great opening question. I think there's 2 things to say there. The first is with my what does the literature tell us brain, the rational bit, which is, study after study points us to educator expertise. And when I say educator, I mean everybody that works in a school context. We are talking a lot about teachers, but also school leaders. So the literature points us to educator expertise being the thing that we should double down on if we want to make sure that every kid, regardless of their background, gets a great education. I'm not one of the people who says, structures and systems don't matter. I love talking about regional schools commissioners and head teacher boards as well. I do think structures matter, but I think they matter insofar as they create the conditions where everybody in our system can keep getting better, particularly frontline teachers who are working closest with pupils. So for anybody that wants to see a great education system for everybody, like this is the thing that we should devote, I think, the most time and energy and effort to thinking hard about. That's the rational bit of brain. The feeling of this for me is important because I did grow up in Morecambe, but I grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of resources. The first few years of my childhood were spent living in a caravan next to a big nuclear power station in this sort of pretty dilapidated and poor seaside town. And when I was 11, got this golden ticket to go to the local grammar school, and got a great education there. It was fantastic. My teachers were amazing. In fact, some of them have been in touch this week off the back of Oak Academy, which is sort of slightly weird. One of my history teachers in particular pointed out that he'd been having a look. But my siblings didn't get that opportunity, right? I'm the only person from my family that got that golden ticket. And what I had access to was expert teachers, really, really good teachers who thought really hard, had worked really hard, had lots of experience, had lots of expertise in helping me learn the things that I needed to learn. And, still to this day, there are members of my family who are going to schools that aren't investing as much as they should be in improving the expertise of their teachers. And so my nephews and nieces aren't getting the sort of education that I was afforded even a generation later. That's not okay. It's very personal to me. And if we invest more in this, we have the best possible chance of making sure every single one of those kids gets a great education. And we do it through working closely. Dylan Williams, love the one you're with. We've got a group of teachers in the system. They get out of bed every day to do the best that they possibly can for their pupils. And we know some stuff that's going to help them to keep getting better. And it's our job to think about that stuff, curate it, share it generously and openly with them so that they can make the most of it.
Brilliant. As somebody who comes from your neck of the woods, important to point out that lots of schools that aren't grammar schools that have equally invested in their teachers and are doing a great job, which I know is
absolutely. Yeah.
Anyway, so let's just get to the term teacher, educator, expertise, and perhaps do a little bit of unpacking of what you mean by that term.
Yeah.
Some definitions maybe might be helpful.
Yeah, definitions super helpful. So the first thing I think it's important for us to do is be really clear on the context in which teachers work. Teachers work in what Kahneman calls a low validity environment. What we mean by that is they work in an environment where you don't get very fast and immediate feedback on the things that you do in relation to the impact that you want them to have. So a high validity environment, for example, would be darts. You throw a dart, pretty instantaneously whether you've done a good job of throwing that dart or not. It's a high validity environment. When we do things in schools, it's a low validity environment, which means that we don't get that feedback very quickly. So it's quite hard to figure out whether the things that you're doing are having the impact that you intend them to have. So it's just important to note that context in which we're talking about expertise here. We're talking about experts in low validity environments, not experts in high validity environments. It means we'll think slightly differently about how we develop it. So then what do we mean by expertise? Let's define that. We mean efficiently and effectively solving persistent problems. I'll unpack that in a second, in a particular domain. So Anders Ericsson is the kind of expert on experts. You know, we are efficiently and effectively solving persistent problems within a particular domain. We're not trying to develop transferable skills in any way, shape or form. So all of the debates that happen in schools about can we develop creativity by explicitly teaching it, apply here. Like, we're not trying to do this thing that's entirely transferable. It tends to be domain specific and doesn't transfer very well. So let's talk about persistent problems, that third definition. So these are universal. They apply to everybody doing this job. They're causal and they're controllable challenges in a particular role. So let's unpack those things all together. We've got these low validity environments. We're not getting immediate feedback. We're trying to efficiently and effectively solve this set of problems that are universal to people like us, are in our control, and you know, they're common challenges to the job that we do. If you can say, look, what I can do in this low validity environment is nail these persistent problems every time I'm presented to them, we should broadly describe you as an expert in that particular field. And we need to apply lots of knowledge about teaching to figure out the definition of educator expertise. So that's sort of the first bit of what we mean when we're talking about expertise, or at least what I take from the literature. And next thing then is like, what is it that then sits underneath that? And this is where Ambition Institute, we talk a lot about mental models. So this is just a fancy way of saying what somebody knows and how that stuff, how that knowledge that they have is used to guide their actions. We want lots of knowledge in our teachers, and we want that knowledge organized in a way that guides their actions. The more knowledge they have, the better organized it is, the better they can solve the persistent problems. The more they solve the persistent problems, the more likely they are to be broadly described as an expert within that field. That, I think, is my best attempt in a nutshell of explaining what I mean when I say educator expertise. I mean somebody who has a really developed mental model for solving the persistent problems of the domain in which they work.
So, need lots of knowledge, need a mental model, which means that that knowledge is organised in a way that you can access the right knowledge at the right time. Really complex, sophisticated set of things that we're asking of our teachers, our educators. There, it's no wonder we're all exhausted at the end of the day when that's what we've been trying to do. So how do you develop that expertise then? So, you know, you've described something really complex, multifaceted, obviously very important to have the right impact on pupils' learnings. What you haven't really done is tell us, how do you get there? How do you develop that expertise, both in teachers and in school leaders, actually, which, as you said, is a domain in itself? Yeah.
My colleague Peps has a really good way of thinking about this, which is helpful, I think, before we get into the mechanics of the how, which is we need to think of teaching a bit more like engineering than we do science. What it means by that is what we do with engineers is we do give them lots of knowledge and we help them practice using that knowledge. We try to build this mental model so that they can solve the persistent problems that they face. But civil engineers in particular, one of the things that they do is build bridges. And every single time they come to a canyon or a river or whatever it is that they need to build over, that canyon or river looks totally different, right? There are a whole load of features that are unique to that individual place where the bridge needs to be built. And what we need to do is develop the mental models of our teachers, just like we develop the mental models of our engineers, which is they have to have the knowledge and the skills to build a bridge, but they also have to be able to apply that knowledge and skill to build a bridge over that canyon or that river or that. And that's a very similar way of thinking about it in schools. It's not like science where it's like, well, this is the answer. We've done an experiment. We figured out this works. This is the way of doing it. We need a much more applied type of expertise, much more similar to engineers building bridges over over canyons, because every pupil in every classroom that you come to is going to look and feel a little bit different. And then just to pick up on that point of complexity, this is like one of my lines I roll out again and again and again. So people watching who know me are just going to groan, collective groan. But for those who haven't heard it, here goes. What we ask teachers to do is to think about the thinking of around, in England, 30 small, wonderful humans simultaneously for 20-ish hours a week. We don't ask any other professionals to do that level of complex thinking about other people's thinking. If I'm just trying to think about your thinking right now, Sam, that is a hard enough job to do in itself without trying to do that simultaneously with 30 who are small and maybe 4 years old and not going to sit down quite where you'd like them to, so that you could really concentrate on that process. So this is really demanding, this is really hard, and I push hard back against anybody who thinks that this job is simple. It is far from it. It's incredibly complex, and becoming an expert takes a really long time. And it's really hard work. I'm going to answer your actual question now, I promise, which is how do you develop this?
That's good.
At least I admit when I don't answer questions like politicians who just sort of carry on. So two things here that I think are interrelated. Let's talk first about that mental model. We need two things. We need it to be big. We need lots of knowledge in it. And we need that knowledge to be organized around those persistent problems that we face, so that we're guiding our action in a way that's likely to lead to a successful outcome. How do we build knowledge? Candidly, through pretty explicit instruction, heavily guided instruction to make sure people know and learn new things. Very similar to how we would teach anybody anything. The violin, mathematics, any other field, there's just some stuff that we need new teachers in particular to know, and the best way of doing it is to just teach it to them. And we have to get a bit more comfortable, I think, as a profession, of going to sessions at whatever stage in our career when we don't know something, and listening to experts teach us, using all of the techniques that we know work to teach people things, revisiting them over time, low stakes quizzes. Those sorts of methods of instruction are really effective for teaching things, and we should use them more on ourselves. The second thing that we then do is organize that knowledge, and that's where I think deliberate practice plays a big part. So there's a whole spectrum of this, from incredibly artificial, so you in front of the mirror practicing your explanation of Pythagoras theorem, or maybe watching one of those Oak videos and seeing somebody else do it and then having a go yourself, right the way through to pretty authentic, right? You might be trying to do that live in a classroom with somebody observing you and giving you feedback. We have some coaches who stand at the back of classes and can give live feedback and instructions midway through lessons. So what we've got to do is we've got to practice, and teachers don't practice as much as lots of other professions, partly because they don't have the time to do so. And I'd love to see us create more time and more opportunities for teachers to practice. So I think we build that mental model by teaching teachers stuff and then helping them to practice its application, help them practice building bridges over lots of different types of valleys, so that that expertise becomes more and more and more adaptive. They're never going to find another valley quite like the one they practiced on, but there are some that are a bit more similar than others, and more similarities, I think, is a good thing. There are then, and this is the area that I'm definitely most out of my depth on, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. There's then some work to do on kind of behavior change and motivation. There are some cognitive approaches, so thinking about self-efficacy and regulation. There are some social approaches, so norms and the environment people work in. And then there are some behavioral approaches, so habits and habit formation. All of those things, I think, are underdeveloped in our discourse and conversation about teacher education at the moment. I think we could learn loads from our behavioral psychology colleagues in other parts of our universities to help us think more about the behavior change and motivation rather than just the instructional approaches. We're certainly, and my thinking and expertise in that space is certainly way behind other colleagues and where I think it should be.
So that's really helpful and actually really clear. What I'm interested in, if you've ever looked at any of my research, and you probably haven't actually, Matt, I need to send you my PhD sometime, is I think there's a phasing needed, isn't there? Particularly thinking about really new teachers or maybe even trainee teachers, in terms of what kind of knowledge you need at what point, because you can't possibly take it all on board at once, and not all of it makes sense to you initially in the way it does do later on when you've had more of that practicing, more of that experience, more of all the range of kinds of experiences under your belt. I think what the literature in expertise tells us is that in order to be really expert, you need some things to become automatic. And so probably early on in your experience, in your training, you need to be focusing on those things that eventually become automatic, a bit like learning to drive, where, you know, I can remember my dad telling me about bike points and clutches and accelerators and all that, and to really, really focus on that. And yet, you know, a few months later, you don't even know when you've changed gear, do you? Because it's become automatic. Have you got any thoughts about any kind of sense of phasing? You know, what do people need really early on that you hope eventually becomes so automatic later that they can then maybe be focusing on the higher order knowledge that they need in order to make this learning accessible to this pupil at this particular moment in time?
Yeah, so teachers are humans too, and unfortunately the current point in our evolutionary cycle as a species means that our kind of cognitive infrastructure, like our brains and how they work, aren't well suited to the task of thinking about the thinking of 30 small other humans. We just haven't evolved very well to do that yet. And, you know, who knows, another millennia and maybe we'll get there. You know, we know that you can attend to something like 4 or 5 things at any one time, regardless of what it is you're doing, whether you're trying to remember a phone number or teach mathematics to a group of 30. If you don't have the knowledge committed to your mental model in your long-term memory, if you don't know this stuff and you haven't practiced it, if you don't get to that automaticity, what you are trying to do is attend to a whole range of really complex things in your classroom all at the same time. Like, are they sat down? Are they looking at me? Am I explaining the right thing? Where are we in the lesson? Did I do the register? Why is that mobile phone going off? Like, you're already done, right? You can maybe attend to 1 or 2 of those things at any one time. And I think David Weston might have spoken about this yesterday in his presentation. One of the things that you can observe when it comes to experts is they often do less. So they often make fewer decisions, they're cooler and they're calmer. It looks, and we've all been here, right? You go in, you watch an expert teacher teach, and it just looks like they're not doing anything. And all the kids are still learning and sat down, behaving themselves. The teacher's not doing, like, now, a lot of that is about, you know, routines and reputation and all of those sorts of things, but they are able to, you know, lift their head up and see things in the classroom that novice teachers, particularly early in their career, just aren't able to see. My sort of personal connection to this is, like, I know I was a teacher for that first 3 months when I was in you know, school at the very start of my teaching career. I know September to Christmas happened. I know I was there, like, I got paid. So, and I genuinely cannot pinpoint anything that happened. I can't remember it, because the whole time I was just in this state of cognitive overload of trying to think about all of these various things all at the same time. So when it comes to training new teachers, or indeed anybody new to any domain as they move further and further and more senior up the structure, you know, I suspect being a head teacher for the first term probably feels a little bit like that as well. Anything that we can do to give a really solid knowledge foundation of the important things, and help practice so that the first time you're doing something isn't live in front of 30 kids. And this is where there's a huge responsibility on our bit of the system that does the teacher development work, like how we can sequence the curriculum that makes reasonable expectations of people over a long period of time. And it's why I'm most excited about the early career framework and the revised set of new national professional qualifications, because what that does for the first time, and, you know, it won't be perfect, like, we're going to want to iterate on this, but it says, look, here's a reasonable chunk of stuff for people to learn in the 9 months whilst they're on their PGCE or whatever training route they're doing. Here's a reasonable chunk of stuff for them to learn in the first 2 years whilst they're teaching. And then here's a reasonable chunk for them to learn if they become a middle leader or a senior leader or a head teacher or an exec head or an NLE. And that chain, that curriculum sequence is coherent. Again, we just need to think back to what we would do with small humans, right? If we tried to teach them everything about mathematics when they were 5, we'd think that was mad, right? We'd say, well, there's no way they're going to cover all that content. You can do a lesson a week on all of this stuff, but it's just not going to work. The same applies for teachers. We have to break the content down and prioritize some things that I think are really important. It's really hard to do that. I mean, but I'm a big fan of, first term, just help them get the classroom environment like safe and secure and everybody feeling comfortable, get those routines and systems right. Because back to that overload point, even when you're an expert, thinking about explanations is still really difficult. And if you've got kids not doing the things that they're supposed to be doing because the routines and systems aren't there, you're going to really struggle. So yeah, start with that, then move on to some of the sort of translation of curriculum plans into lessons is probably another big part. And then like expositions and modeling are probably the other big high leverage thing that I think we can do with teachers right at the start of their career.
Yeah, and again, I think sort of useful advice there for, I know this session isn't just aimed at trainees, but they're very much on my mind at the moment because I'm talking to a lot who maybe have got their first job, they know they're going to be an NQT in September, and they're just really anxious about what am I doing in this phase of my training, where normally I would be really getting my sort of feet under the table and really feeling like I'm getting to grips with being a real teacher.
Yeah.
Actually, what you've just said, because they are as advanced as they are in their courses, they can come at these videos and the other things that they can sort of really sit down and think about almost a thing at a time, as opposed to 1,000 things at a time as they would be if they were in school. And they know what they're looking for and they know what they're analysing for. It's actually a great opportunity.
And the videos won't help you with the classroom management part for obvious reasons. That's top. There are other resources out there, but the model for any teacher, in fact, like how to explain and model, and having an example, not the example, just an example to look at and compare with what you would probably say if you were explaining this thing. That's a really helpful thing, a thought process to go through.
Exactly, and that comparing, it might be that you actually come to a conclusion that's not how I do it. I don't particularly think this is a model that works, but that's just as valuable.
Yeah.
the deconstruction of your reasons for that as anything else. That's great. So I realise I'm completely not sticking to any of the questions that we agreed on earlier, Matt. I hope that's okay. But I think we did say let's move on and think a bit about leaders now.
Yeah.
Because that's again a probably domain specific set of knowledge and expertise that needs to be developed in school leaders. What are your thoughts about how do we do that? We can. So I think you've taken us through a really clear set of things and kinds of processes that are really useful for teachers in developing their expertise. How does that work for leaders?
So this is the bit where I think it is largely the same. Is I suppose my starting point, right? So I think what we have done, for very good reasons, and I can understand why we do it, is we've created a sense that teachers learn like this, and there's then this sort of slightly artificial line, and then leaders learn like this. The theoretical framework, for want of a better phrase, that these very smart, much smarter than me academics have worked hard on for years and years and years, doesn't make that distinction in the same way that I think we do. If you are an expert, back to definitions, you are good at solving the persistent problems of the role that you have. You solve them efficiently and effectively, more efficiently and effectively than your intermediate and more novice colleagues. To solve those problems, you need adaptive expertise. The adaptive expertise comes from the mental model that you have, which is a combination of what you know and how that knowledge is organized. And school leaders just need a different combination of things in their mental model organized slightly differently. And so I don't think and then when it comes to it, I think you probably need to set things up slightly differently to get the motivation right. You do need to respect people's current professional expertise and bring that into any training and development that they might have. You need to do that for everybody. You just need to be a little bit more careful, I think, as people get more experience and senior in the system. But if it's the first time you're a senior leader and it's the first time you're coming across some content on governance, for example, so you're a deputy head, that might be the first time you need to start interacting with your governing body or your trust board. There's some new things that you need to know about governance. And the best way for you to find those things out is for someone to teach them to you really well. And to use all of the methods of instruction that we know work really well for teaching other humans things. And you need to practice the application of that stuff that you've learned by practicing. And yeah, it's really good if you practice your presentation to the board before you go to the board. I do that every time. It's worth thinking about the sorts of questions that you might get and be able to answer those questions. It is worth practicing drafting papers and notes to them that they might ask and they might hold you to account on. And the same applies for finance and HR and other things that you pick up as you become more and more senior in a school context. So, like, yes, the valley that you're building your bridge in looks completely different. And yes, you need more sophisticated materials, or sophisticated is maybe the wrong word. You need a wider array of materials to build your bridge because there are a wider range of domains that you're responsible for. But the task is still the same. You need to take what you know and you need to build the bridge over the valley. And so whether you're a teacher or a middle leader or a senior leader or a head teacher, I think that theoretical framework holds. And I think what matters more is whether you're a novice or intermediate or expert performer within that domain. And where you are on that level of proficiency is the thing that's most important for adapting the sort of development that you're going to get. If you're an expert and you're trying to get better, me sitting down and explaining it to you and giving you some low stakes quizzing is probably not going to work very well. Me giving you something to go and do some inquiry on with another expert so that you can push the thinking of the field probably is. So yeah, I'm not convinced that leadership is really a thing. I think it is a word that is so hard to define, it's so slippery. Like, I think it is just much more helpful to talk about expertise in different roles. And some of those roles require you to solve a different range of problems that involve more humans. And that's harder because you're coordinating more people. But there's this thing called leadership that you're developing. I'm not really sure what that is. And I'm not really sure that it's a very helpful term. It's certainly not a helpful term in education unless you put school in front of it, because it's even more vague and generic if you're talking about the differences between leading a biscuit factory, leading a football team, and leading a secondary school. They're all really different. And I'm not sure there's that much that's useful that transfers.
So does it come back to your initial definition of sort of expertise then, in terms of the persistent problems in the domain in which you're working?
Right. And the best thing that we can do is think about what are the persistent problems at every level in our system, from brand new teacher right the way through to chief exec of a multi-academy trust of 30 schools. And those problems look different. Because the problems are different, you need different knowledge and skill to solve them. And therefore we need to think about developing the knowledge and skill that helps you solve the persistent problems of the role that you're in. And yeah, like, some stuff transfers up with you and is a helpful foundation. Some new stuff gets added, but the application of that knowledge to that persistent problem is going to look different.
Yeah, so and I think it's probably important to point out that it's not necessarily always sort of hierarchical and linear.
Nope.
So, for example, in my research, I'm stating the bleeding obvious in a way, but one of the things that really sort of initially knocks trainees back in terms of what they're thinking about in relation to their practice and the expert or not knowledge that they're drawing on is changing class or changing school or changing a subject.
Yeah.
So suddenly they're having a whole new set of persistent problems in front of them, children they don't know, or a subject area they're less familiar with. And so the things that had become automatic in their previous domain that had become familiar, they're now having to think about in a much more conscious way. So, for example, that's why behaviour and routines and so on, you have to go back to them every September, regardless of how experienced you are, because you're re-establishing those things. So there's a period of time when you are focusing on those rather than maybe the higher order sort of cognitive aspects of children's learning, because you know that you need to get those things in place before you can then free up your headspace, and indeed the learner's headspace, in order to come back to the kind of the thing that you're really wanting them to learn, which isn't actually the relationship, the routine and so on. It's actually whatever it is that you're trying to teach them.
We didn't dig into the types of knowledge that might be in a teacher's mental model, right? But the thing that you've nailed there is, like, one of the huge types of knowledge is like the contextual knowledge that you have about your pupils, like pupil knowledge. And I don't just mean, you know, how they behave and who they like and who they don't like, although that's important. I mean, what they know and what they don't know. And so you know, one of my frustrations is when we try to judge a teacher's expertise by, when they're on an interview, by getting them to teach a class they don't know. Well, you have immediately removed a huge chunk of the expertise that they have and asking them to perform at the same level that they might perform in their school. Like, they're just not going to be able to do that. If you move classes, you by definition are, you have lost the utility from one chunk of knowledge that you have mastered, and you need to rebuild it. And so your expertise takes a dip until you rebuild that contextual knowledge that you previously had. Absolutely,
and the sort of psychological and emotional impact of that can be very de-skilling. So it can make you feel like you suddenly don't know anything, when actually you do know. You retain all the knowledge that you had. You're just trying to reapply it into a new context, where at the same time you're needing to learn the new things from that context. I think it's the same when you move into a leadership position. Yeah. Do feel quite de-skilled. Looking at the questions that we used last time, there were some about assessment that I can't even remember asking you or discussing, and it might just be that we've moved on in our thinking since then. There was something about the sort of validity of assessing expertise, whether we're talking about teacher expertise, leader expertise, or whatever. Have you got any thoughts that you want to share about that? Or
I'll be very brief. I don't think we can reliably assess teacher expertise or leadership expertise. I found no assessment instrument that I think is reliable. I've certainly never found one that I think is reliable and scalable. I've not read anything, I've not seen anything that I am really confident like accurately grasps that. You can probably assess the knowledge, although it's a bit politically spicy, by giving people a test. That's one part of it, as we've discussed. It's really difficult to assess the application part of it.
Absolutely.
And that the relationship between pupil outcomes and teacher actions is really noisy. And so I'm not convinced that putting lots of effort into figuring this out when I say figuring this out, I'm not convinced that frontline professionals putting loads of energy and effort into figuring this out is a good use of their time. I think we should be leaning on our colleagues in academia to keep wrestling with this problem and try to figure it out for us, because they're better placed to do it. But
nice on that, yeah.
There's no assessment instrument or instruments that I have ever seen that I'm convinced are a good combination. If anybody has them, I'd love to see them, but I think they're probably, you know, some sort of criterion-based rubric, which doesn't work. Probably some sort of observation thing, which might work if you have like 14 or is it highly skilled observers doing multiple observations, which just isn't scalable. The current MPQs have these essays, which don't tell us anything. Focus your energy on trying to get better. Don't focus your energy on trying to summatively assess whether you're better or not.
Yeah, although ITT providers and sadly have to, because they've got to make those judgments about whether they're going to recommend.
And then this is the conundrum we're in, right? You've got to do something.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Anyway, let's swiftly move on from that. So I think the final thing I'm going to ask you before opening up to questions is where you feel currently your work is at its weakest, where you feel there's more to do.
Great question. More to do, but I think coming, mainly because I just rely on smarter people than me to do the work, which is like
Peps is going to come up here.
Yeah, exactly, which is a classic for me. So I mentioned it earlier, which is in the sort of behavior change space, particularly in relation to motivation. And I'm going to shamelessly plug Peps's book, which I think is about to come out. I don't think it's out yet. He's going to be upset with me that I don't know the answer to that. I think it's coming out. And it's all about motivation, which Peps talks about as convincing people to direct their limited cognitive resources at a particular task. And it's something that is really important for teachers to know lots about with their pupils. It's also really important for teacher educators to know about teachers. And I don't know enough about it. I haven't thought enough about it. And Peps has thought loads about it and has got some ideas on it. And it will start a conversation about motivation that I think we'll all enjoy having. So
we just need to read the book, basically.
We just need to read that book, but we definitely don't know enough about that.
Yeah, I agree.
I suppose the other thing I would say is, we use, I have used and continue to use the language of bets when we're talking about this stuff, right? Learning bets. What we mean by that is the literature doesn't tell us definitively that this is the answer or that is the answer. What we try to do is read as widely as possible, take as many inferences from that reading as widely as possible, and come up with what we think are the best bets for us to place our time and energy and effort on. I mean, I'm an economics teacher by training, and we have to accept that there's an opportunity cost here. As we said earlier, we can't teach everything, and misalignment in our approach to either teaching or teaching teachers, I think, is more damaging than taking a position, putting a stake in the ground and saying, we're going to do it like this, and getting aligned around that approach, and being really open and willing to change your mind and move your stake if evidence and literature comes along to the contrary. We have done that, multiple times over the past 5 years, where we've gone down a particular road and then gone, back up from there. And so as long as you're willing to change where your stake is, I think it's much better to put a stake in the ground, make a bet, and accept that you might be wrong, than to say, God, this is all too hard. And what we're going to do is we're going to just show you everything, because if we show you everything, you'll then be able to decide. Like, I don't think that works for novices. And so I think picking and choosing and going in a direction is the best way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can get completely paralyzed by the complexity of it all.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the language of best bets works for me, as long as you always qualify it in the way you just have, in terms of that openness. It is a bet. That's all it is.
Yeah.
There's so many variables. There's so much complexity. It's such a contested area that we're working in, that you always need to be open.
Yeah. And you need to do that with goodwill and openness to your colleagues who've got smart things to say. I've learned loads from people giving me a hard time, and it's
absolutely
great.
Yeah, and that actually leads really nicely into the first question. In a minute, I'm going to have a look at what's on the screen.
Yeah.
But Rachel Rossiter actually messaged me earlier with a question, which I think is brilliant, quite hard though.
Right.
Question 2. It is clear that not all agree about the purpose of education and teaching and learning philosophies, understatement brackets.
Yeah.
If we cannot agree on what appears to be very fundamental points, how on earth can we establish what expertise looks like? Isn't expertise subjective and contextual? I think that follows on quite nicely from what you've been saying. And probably the answer is yes.
So I'll say yes and say a little bit more. So I use the analogy here of the peloton at the Olympics, which is the event where the bikes have to ride in a really tight formation in a line round and round the velodrome. And the first bike is what do you think the purpose of education is bike, and is contested. And that's great in our system, I think. I think it's a good thing that we have a diverse system where people can disagree. And I get very frustrated with attempts by people who think the purpose is different things, trying to sort of grab levers of power and prevent other people from thinking that there is a different approach on both sides. I think what's more important though, I don't care what you think the purpose of education is. I don't care whether you think it's for jobs for the future or you think it's the canon. You should think about that and you should have a view, but I don't mind which one it is. The thing that I think is more important is that you line your school bike, which is the second bike, or your teacher bike, maybe the second bike, closely behind your purpose bike. And because that means that everything that you think about and do in your curriculum is driving towards that purpose that you think is more important. It's an entirely values-based decision. The bit where I get frustrated is your second bike needs to be evidence informed. It's really important that whatever you think the purpose is, we look to the literature to help us choose approaches that drive towards that purpose. And if you think it is, every kid leaving school super creative, that's great. There are just evidence informed ways of getting there. Trying to directly teach creativity probably isn't one of them, right? Your third bike is then your school bike, culture, ethos, all of those things pointing towards that. And we trundle behind here, Sam, on the fourth bike, right? Which is, how do you develop your teachers so they create the sort of school that drives towards the purpose that you want? And that means that the different teacher training and development and CPD organizations should also be clear about what they think the purpose of education is, so that they can work with schools who share that purpose and develop teachers who drive towards a particular outcome. And so let me give you a really great example of this. The early rollout of the Early Career Framework has 4 national providers who are doing some of the rollout. It has Ambition Institute, it has Teach First, it has the IOE, and then it has the Education Development Trust, working closely with Sam and her team at Sheffield Hallam. We don't all agree on what we think the purpose of education is. Like, we have slightly different views. So there's slightly different views. They're not wildly different. We're all sort of broadly, in the political terms, sort of centrist dad middle grounders. But there is a diversity of view there. And like, schools should, when they're looking to work with one of those providers for the rollout of the Early Career Framework, think about this question of like, how aligned are my values with that training provider's values? Because if they're misaligned, what you're going to get is a program that steers towards a particular view on what they think the purpose of education is, and it's going to feel misaligned to your school. So I think the diversity is good. You should choose, make sure what you drive to is evidence informed. And this applies to teacher training providers just like it applies to schools. Diversity here is a really good thing. We should disagree on this fundamental question and not try to force people to agree with us.
Now, this is where I just really wish we were all in a room together and Rachel was there and I could check whether
she agreed or not. Let's see on Twitter later.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. So now I'm going to try and navigate some of the questions that people have posted. So just bear with me a minute.
No problem.
I don't know if you want to have a look as well, Matt, or whether you just...
Yeah, sure. Let me pick up a couple of quick ones. What do I mean by the term self-efficacy? So I mean the belief that you have control over your own environment or your own circumstances. It's a big feature of feeling safe and motivated. We want teachers to feel like they are the masters of their destiny. They've got control. And it's a really important thing for us to understand how we develop people's sense of self-efficacy. Great.
Actually, as I can see, you can see the questions without having to manipulate like I can. Are you all right just having a look through yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to take Rahima's on how would you do teacher appraisals. So this is all super controversial. The school leaders are going to go crazy here. So I would once a year have you sit down with your line manager and have a conversation with them about the things that you want to get better at over the year. And I'd write those down and I'd think about them and I'd think about the support that was required to get them. I would then let you and your line manager meet and talk about those as much or as little as you'd like over the year. And I would do no form of summative assessment at the end of that process. I wouldn't put you in a box. I wouldn't observe you or grade you. The only thing that I would consider the utility for that process is if we were looking to promote you, one of the things that I would want to know is how well or how enthusiastically have you engaged with your own development. And that would be high on my list of things that I would care about if I was going to give you a promotion. But other than that, I want you to have a chat with someone who can help you to get better in a way that works for you. And everything else, I think, is, including the performance-related pay that sometimes gets attached, is not a good use of time. What's the best idea to get staff on board with ideas such as practice in and CPD in general? But let's take the practice point. This is really hard. Teachers do not like doing this. We do it with thousands of them a year. And the first times you do it feels really icky and awful, and people don't like doing it. I think you have to start out by explaining some of what I explained earlier, which is why practice is really important. Like, why do we think pupils practicing mathematics questions is really important? Well, what we're trying to do is build some very junior type of adaptive expertise in them so that they can solve problems that they're unfamiliar with that appear in the exam. Like, practicing helps build a mental model. Building a mental model is important for solving problems. Solving problems is an important part of expertise. So this kind of, it's almost metacognitive, right? Like, up front, explaining why you're doing the things that you're doing, I think gives people a sense of, this isn't just some weird thing where I'm being asked to do this thing that's really awkward that's not going to make a difference. Really
good questions here.
how can middle seniors support the development of this expertise? Again, a really good question, and something we're working really hard on with the new MPQ frameworks. The most simple advice I would give there is always ask yourself the question before you go and do any development with teachers. First of all, ask yourself the question, do I know that they need this? Second of all, ask yourself the question, if this were a pupil, what approaches would I take to making sure they knew and were able to apply this thing that I wanted to teach them? And that will probably lead you to some questions of, like, I would plan a sequence of learning really thoughtfully and really carefully. I would choose the methods of instruction that go along with that sequence really thoughtfully and really carefully. And I would try to figure out if the thing that I wanted them to learn has been learned, so that I can use it to inform my next lesson. They're the sorts of things that teachers do all the time. And I would just apply that level of rigor and that level of thinking to developing your teachers. Like, it's a bit more complicated and sophisticated than that. But in the first instance, like, remember that you are incredibly skilled at teaching things to other humans, and not to forget all of those things that you know about how to make that successful, just because it's not a small human, it's a big human. Again, not the most sophisticated answer, but that is certainly a really, really good starting point.
And that's exactly what I meant about you feel de-skilled when you're in a different role. You suddenly think, like, I don't know anything about this. Yeah. But actually you do. There's an awful lot that you can bring from your prior knowledge to this new context that you're needing to apply it into. There's a question that I thought was quite interesting about, as a PGCE student, not in school at the moment. We touched on this earlier. Won't be in school until they start their job in September. Any advice that you might give them in terms of how they use this time?
Yeah, it's just really hard. And there are all kinds of difficulties. My partner recruits and trains social workers, and they're in a really similar situation. So we've got to think about the things that you can do in that time that are most useful. You will have lots of stuff from your course that you can go back and revisit. Remember, we want to commit things to our long-term memory so they're in our mental model, and so going back to some of those things in the first instance is a really good place to start. And speak to the provider, the university or the SCIT or whoever it is. I know lots of them have thought really carefully and really hard about what they do and to maximise trainee and early career teacher learning during this period. So rather than me cutting across them, my first push is, like, go to them. They know you and they know the course and programme and where you're up to better. Things that I would be encouraging them, I think, to include in their programs are, as we said, some of those things that you can do now. So if you have a job in school and you're able to get in touch with the school and get things like schemes of work, that's a really useful thing for you to start to get your head around. And I would use that scheme and any resources you can find, including the ones that are available on the Oak National Academy, to start thinking through and planning what that first term might look like. So I know my first lesson is on multiplying fractions. Practice your first explanation of multiplying fractions. Try to get the economy of language. So try to minimize the number of words that you need to say to explain it. Try and have a practice on a piece of paper and a pen of, like, what your board work might look like. The more that you can replicate that process, maybe you've got a partner or a friend at home, teach a lesson to them, have a go with them. If you don't have them at home or you don't want to put them through that, film yourself doing that explanation and that modeling, and you will just see a whole load of things where you're like, oh, I hadn't thought of that, hadn't thought of that. And then the other thing that I think is also really helpful is challenging yourself, and this is helpful when you do it to someone else because they do this bit of work for you. Challenge yourself to think through the misconceptions that might occur when you're teaching that. So the more prepared you are for pupil A not understanding concept B, again, the less cognitive resources in the moment you're going to have to divert to that task. You're going to know, yeah, okay, I mean, in my case, right, the kids always confuse an appreciation in the exchange rate as being a good thing. They think appreciate sounds like good, therefore if they've got a strong pound, that's a good thing. Well, it is a good thing, but it depends if you're the importer or the exporter. It's a really common economics misconception. Don't be blindsided by that. Like, you've thought through what the misconception is, and you can anticipate it coming, and you can practice what your answer is when that situation likely occurs. I think they're the main things I would say there.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind me just adding to that, I think, you know, I recognise how frustrating it must be, because you would have seen this period as being so vital to your development as a teacher, this time in school. But actually, you know, you've been given a precious gift as well, in that you do have that ability to do a bit of standing back as well. And you know, what Matt was saying earlier about thinking about the purpose of education and how well that aligns with either the school that you've already got a job in or the schools that you might be thinking about applying for jobs in. So some of that big picture thinking is very helpful. But then the really practical stuff that Matt has just been saying, I'd also maybe be thinking about what it's going to be like in schools in September, assuming either they've just come back for the first time or they're back and there's been a weird period, which, you know, we're all living through now, where it means that children will have had a variety of different kinds of experiences during that intervening time. And there will certainly be some children for whom the priority will be in establishing the calm routines, the relationships, the rules, etc. And really allowing yourself the luxury of really spending quite a lot of time on that in September, and worrying a bit less about the higher order things that will come later. Because I think that's going to be so important. Those children are going to need to feel secure. They'll have been quite sort of freaked by what's happened. You know, for some of them, challenging things will have happened in their own lives. And I think giving that security and that consistency that you get from the school environment is the thing that, if I was you, I'd be really thinking, how am I going to do that, you know, during the first couple of weeks in September. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And how are we doing for time, Sam?
We've got 3 minutes left.
3 minutes. I'll do a quick fire. So Marcus has asked, putting things that you're trying to develop on your classroom door and inviting others to do that. I think that's great. I think it's a really good idea. And when you are, inviting feedback from your colleagues, that contributes to a culture of other people doing that. So if you're willing to be vulnerable and put yourself out there, I think that's great. And the second thing is, one of the things that you need to do with feedback is like choose which of it you take on and which you don't. And the more targeted and specific it is, the more helpful it's likely to be to you. So asking someone to come in and take a look at a very specific thing that you're trying to work on is going to be much more helpful than somebody coming in and making some broad general statement that it's very difficult to do anything with. So I think that's a really, really good idea. And then you've asked about this sort of domains of knowledge. So there's a paper on the Ambition Institute website, which called What is Teaching Expertise? We tried to identify 4 things. So we had what we call path knowledge. So what we mean by that is the content that you're trying to teach, its order and its common misconceptions. So it's a little broader than what might normally be described as subject knowledge, although that's a critical part of it. Pupil knowledge, we've already spoken about. We don't teach that very explicitly. When I started training, it was basically, people said, get to know your kids. And the advice was, go watch the football and the netball team and sit in the staff room and have someone go down the register and tell you which are the naughty ones. That was basically it. I think we can do that much better. We could do that in a much more structured way than we currently do. The third one is, Pep calls it pedagogical knowledge. It is basically all of the cognitive and behavioral science that we're pretty confident is useful. How memory works, for example, is a really useful thing for teachers to know. So that's the sort of third category. And then the fourth category is about self-regulation. So it's about yourself and how you learn and what it is that you need, and what it is that's going to motivate you. I think if a teacher has good knowledge across those 4 areas, I think that's a really good start. Ndidi's here. Lovely to see you, Ndidi. He's asking about join up between services. It's a really interesting conversation, and one that actually, again, my partner and I have been having this morning. There is a real opportunity coming out of this for really close working between social care, social services, children's services, and schools. You know, the school where I'm chair of governors, we're calling all of our most vulnerable pupils every day, if they're not in school, which most of them are. We're then calling other pupils 2 or 3 times a week if we're a little worried, and then everybody's getting a phone call every week. Now, not every school is doing that, but the richness of data that we will have at the end of this process about our cohort of pupils, it is essential that we share that with the local authority so that they can, make the most of it when supporting children. So I agree with you about joining things up. It just remains the thing that's on everybody's list that nobody seems to quite manage.
Yeah.
I
think
think
we're out
probably
of
out of
time.
time.
I'm really sorry.
That's all right.
If I can just give, well, first of all, huge thank you to you. I thought you managed to cover an awful lot of ground in a relatively short time, and go into some depth. And I always find it fascinating hearing you speak. Also, the subject of educator expertise, teacher expertise, will be picked up again by me in my researchEDHome. I can't remember when it is now. It's entitled the ITT Core Content Framework, which I will be talking about, but I'll first be talking about a lot of research I've been involved in terms of how that expertise gets developed over time. So I hope some of you might tune into that. And thanks again, Matt.
Great. Thanks all. Have a good day.
Can we still